Hello everyone! Today we're going to be shell swapping these Joy-Cons with my fancy custom LED mod with these shells from Extreme Rate. So let's jump right in. Okay, we're going to start off with the right hand controller, and the first thing we have to do is remove these 4 tri-wing screws. Keep in mind, once we open this thing up, you're going to see some wires. That's just my LED modification, and you can ignore it. Now with our 4 screws removed, we can just pry this thing open with our fingernails and flip it right open. And once we're inside, the first thing we always want to do is disconnect the battery. Then we can just pry the battery out using some tweezers. After that, we can remove our 3 screws that are holding this cover on. And here we just have to get the antenna out of the way. And now we just have to be careful not to damage this ribbon cable as we flip this open. And we can go ahead and get that unplugged. And now we can detach our player indicator LEDs. And we'll come over here and unplug our bind and charge cable. We'll get this button out of the way before it loses itself. And we'll use some tweezers here to carefully remove this antenna. And now we'll unplug our speakers. I grab them with the tweezers from this angle so that if I do slip, it doesn't damage the wires. And we can just pull that speaker straight up and out. Now we can come over and unplug our joystick. And we just remove those 2 screws. After that, we can pull it straight out. Now for these 2 ribbon cables, I'm just going to unclip them for right now. We'll come over here and we'll remove our last 2 screws that are holding in our main circuit board. And now after making sure that it's not stuck down to anything, we're just going to give it a lift, give it a little jiggle, and you'll see those ribbon cables both come right off. And that's that. And now we can carefully peel this ribbon cable up. And then we'll get some tweezers under there, and it's just going to kind of fly right out. Now this next part here is also just kind of glued in with a piece of double-sided adhesive. And I really feel like this piece here is optional. I took the honors of installing it on this see-through case, but I did not like the way that it looked, so I put it right back. So then let's go ahead and get our home button moved over here. Followed by the plus button. And then we'll get our A, B, X, and Y installed. And in hindsight, I realized I should have put this thing on first. No big deal though, and it's really easy to line up using these pins here. Now I found it was easiest to actually plug this piece in to our main circuit board and then put the main circuit board back into the controller. It's a real nightmare trying to get 2 ribbon cables that are both glued down to plug into a circuit board at the same time. And by the way, did you miss that piece? Yeah, it was stuck to the bottom of the circuit board. Now we'll just get this ribbon cable plugged in before we screw anything down. And now that it's plugged in, we will get things screwed down. Now I used a few of these screws that came with the kit, but I would not recommend it, and you're going to find out why soon enough. Just kind of make sure that that's stuck down. And we'll set our speaker in place. We'll go ahead and get that plugged in. And then we can place our joystick. That just kind of falls right into place, and then we'll set our 2 screws. And this ribbon cable here is actually really easy to plug in if you don't have these wires in the way, but you don't, only I do. I'll go ahead and get this R button in place here. It kind of wants to spring out on me. And for the ZR button here, it comes right out with the pick. You got 2 springs and the kit comes with new ones. And we just have 1 screw holding this small circuit board in. And we'll just put that right onto our new piece here. Again, don't recommend using that screw. And the button here has these pins on the bottom of it, and they line right up with those 2 springs. Just like so. And then we'll change our angle here so you can see how this snaps together. And we'll just make sure that everything's lined up and functional. It's really hard to plug this cable back in and record it, but here we go. And there it is. Now let's go ahead and shell swap this piece. It's a whopping 1 screw. And it just kind of comes apart like so. There is the 1 button on it. And just to make sure that the button is properly engaged. And this screw actually stripped right out and never got tight. I ended up replacing it with a regular Nintendo one. So we'll just come over here and plug in our player indicator LEDs, followed by our charging and communications cable. And now we can flip this piece into place. And we'll install our 3 screws, but this one right here is stripped right out. At this point, I decided to only use the screws that came with the Nintendo Joy-Cons themselves to avoid any further issues. And here you can see I replaced it with the Nintendo one, and it actually came down tight. It's interesting that it came with these different screws. They have a finer thread, and they're a little bit smaller. Now we'll just come over here and get our antenna plugged back in using some tweezers. And if you're going to plug the battery in using tweezers like me, do make sure not to short those terminals together. And that's everything. We're ready to close this thing up. And that's just going to snap shut. And you can see it's already working. It looks really awesome actually. And all we have left is our 4 screws. I did use the extreme rate screws for this because they're Phillips head. They're a finer thread, but they're Phillips head, so it's all good. And besides that, they went in without stripping anything out. And that is complete. And it looks gorgeous. And now for the left-hand controller. Okay, we'll start off by removing our 4 tri-wing screws. Now keep in mind before we take a peek inside of this does have my custom modification inside of it, so you're going to see some wires in there that you will not have inside of your Joy-Con, but everything else works exactly the same. Now with the 4 screws out, we can pry this thing apart with our fingernails and flip it right open. Once we're inside, the first thing we always want to do is disconnect the battery. And we'll just use some tweezers to gently pry the battery out. Once the battery is out of the way, we want to remove the first 3 screws, leaving the remainder 2 alone for now. This piece has a ribbon cable attached to it, so you want to be careful not to damage it. Let's just get that out of the way. We'll remove the L button before it falls out by itself. And now we'll detach this ribbon cable. And we can remove these two small circuit boards that are connected together. And then we can detach the ribbon cable for our player indicator LEDs. And we'll come over here and remove the connection for our bind and charging port. Next up, we can get our speaker unplugged, being careful not to damage those tiny wires. And then the speaker pulls straight up and out. Next up, we can unplug our joystick. And then we'll get the two screws removed that holds it in place. And that just comes right out. And now we just have our final two screws holding in our main circuit board. Here you'll notice that my capture button is missing because it's become one with the circuit board. So now we can just get our colorful arrow buttons installed. We'll get our minus button moved over here. And you would move over the capture button just the same way that we did the minus button. I just can't on mine because I fused it to the circuit board with my crazy modification. So now that we got the circuit board in and we made sure that everything is seated correctly, we can go ahead and put our first two screws back in. And you'll see maybe we should hold off on putting that minus button in. Now let's go ahead and put the joystick back in. We just have our two screws. It takes a little bit of effort to get the screw started because there's no threads cut into the holes to start off. And now we can just get our ribbon cable plugged back in here. We'll get that minus button put back in since it fell out. And then we can put the two small circuit boards back in. It's just these three screws, and these small ones actually don't require much effort. And no matter what, on all of these, please don't over tighten them. And we'll hold off on plugging in that ribbon cable. First, we're going to swap out this back cover. It's just one screw. And then it just kind of comes apart like that. We'll get our button moved over here. And just to make sure that our button is working. And we can put our one screw back in. Now, if you are changing out your player indicator LEDs, this is how to do it. It's just these two screws. And you would put a new board on by putting the two screws back in. I actually soldered new LEDs onto this board myself. And if you want to see how I did it, feel free to check out my other video where I did this whole modification. And now let's move on to getting our ZL button replaced. I found it easiest to just cram a pick right in there. There are two springs in there, but I wouldn't worry too much about losing them because the kit comes with new ones. However, it is easy to transfer them right over if you don't lose them. And we just have one screw holding this small circuit board on. And we'll just transfer it right over. And just like on the right side, we'll line up the two pins on the button with these two springs. And then we'll just snap it shut. Make sure everything lines up good and the springs are in place. And we're ready to attach to our main board. First, we'll get these two ribbon cables out of the way. This is our player indicator LEDs. And with that done, we can now plug in the ribbon cable for our shoulder buttons without it being in the way. And then we can just come on over here to this other ribbon cable. This is the best method that I found to attach this ribbon cable. And now we can set our L button in place. We'll rotate this whole assembly right on here like that. And now we can get our last 3 interior screws put back in place. We can go ahead and set our speaker back in. And we'll plug that in using some tweezers. And lastly, we have our battery. Be very careful not to short those battery terminals together if you're using tweezers like I am here. And now we can close it up. All we have left is the 4 screws in the back, and this thing is complete. They're fine threaded, but they're also Phillips head, so it's all good. Because they are fine threaded, it takes a while to get them screwed in. And with that, this controller is complete. And I think this looks really nice. The transparent color gradient goes really well with the LEDs that I added onto this thing. And now we can move on to the final piece, which is the Nintendo Switch backplate. Okay, now for the Nintendo Switch itself, there's really not much to it since it's only the back cover that's getting replaced. But we'll show it nonetheless. For starters, we have, again, 4 tri-wing screws on the back. And in my case, those things were in there really well, and they were quite difficult to get out. Underneath the kickstand here, we're going to want to remove the SD card, and there's a little Phillips head screw. Next up, we'll take these 2 screws out of the bottom next to the USB-C port. And then we'll come around to the top side and we'll take out this Phillips head screw. Now we have 1 screw on each side, and we can use the new shell as a template to make sure that we get the right screw. Same thing on the other side. And this thing will basically just come apart now. You want to start at the bottom and work your way up. When you get around to the top right side here, you're going to want to get your finger behind it and it'll come right off for you. Now we just have 2 Phillips head screws holding the kickstand on. And we'll just unclip it and slide it right through like that. Now for this piece, you just rip this right off, and then you have the 1 screw. And we'll just go ahead and get that out with tweezers and put it on the new piece. We'll get that secured with the screw, and we'll clip that right back on. Now we'll just slide that in from the inside, and we'll secure it with our 2 Phillips head screws. And yes, I did put both screws in, I just forgot to show both of them. Now for the game cartridge cover, we just have our 1 Phillips head screw. This part is very straightforward. And now we can install our vents. They literally just have glue on them. You just peel away the paper and stick them down. And now we can go ahead and put it back together. I reused the tri-wing screws because they were in there so well. I didn't want to risk messing up the threads putting a different screw in them. Okay, and now we can install the 2 Phillips head screws on the bottom here, next to the USB-C port. Then we can come around to the top side and put in this Phillips head screw. We have our 2 Phillips head screws on the sides, 1 on each side. And then we have our final screw down here underneath the kickstand, which is also where the micro SD card goes. And I did notice a cool new feature here. You have to push down with your thumb to get the SD card to release. No big deal. And with that, we are complete. Let's just take a moment here to appreciate this thing's beauty. I mean, this thing really is gorgeous with this color scheme. But I must say, it's very slippery. Well, if you stuck around until now, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. Please take a moment to smash that like button. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. If you have any ideas what you might want to see next, please leave that in the comments below. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you guys next time.